I'd like to welcome Dr. Howard Gardner, Hobbs Professor of Cognition and Education at Harvard University's Graduate School of Education. Dr. Gardner has received the prestigious MacArthur Fellowship Award, along with other awards, for his important and long-lasting contributions to the behavioral and brain sciences. Dr. Gardner is most well known for his theory of multiple intelligences, which he'll tell you about today. Thank you, Howard, for coming to speak to Dalton today.
I think I'm going to use this. Oh, yeah. Testing. Can you hear me? Yeah. Good. Thanks, Annabelle, and thank you all for coming this morning. Was it required? Yes. Actually, I have known Annabelle since she's a baby because we're related to each other. I'm very glad to be here at Dalton, which is a school that's very well known among educators all around the country, if not the world. And I'm glad that the audience is primarily students. I have to say, when I was invited, I thought there'd be about a half a dozen students just sitting around a table, so I have to recalibrate. If we went around the room and asked you all to introduce yourselves, that would take an hour, so probably we shouldn't do that. But I am interested. Am I right that you are students in the 7th grade? Yeah. And some of you in 8th grade? No. So you're all in the 12, 13-year-old range. And we have a few 9th grade. Oh, okay. Some infiltrated. And there are some parents sprinkled around. Parents are not allowed to speak. No, if you have something to say, because I don't want to give a talk. I want to have a conversation. I'm going to ask questions, and don't be shy about responding. I've spent my life as a teacher, and there are no bad answers as long as the answers are honest. Now, if you're trying to get a laugh, that's okay, but you shouldn't just try to get laughs. But if you're being dishonest, you're pretending not to know or trying to fake it, that's not as good. And some of the questions will be just raise your hands, and other ones will be more focused. So let me start by saying, those of you who are in 7th grade, do you all take science? Yeah. And I've been categorized for this morning as a scientist, right? What does it mean? What does it mean to be a scientist? So here's a chance to break the. Yeah, I of course don't know anybody's name, but I see a hand there, and I'm colorblind, so I can't tell what color the sweater is. The gentleman on the aisle. Yeah. Could you stand up, because so I can hear you. Yeah. Which means. Yeah, no, we're not going to let you get away with that. Studying science means what? Do you know? Yeah, I don't want to embarrass you, but on the other hand, it is kind of when you go to the dictionary and they give you a word, when you go back to the other word, and that just takes you back to the word, it doesn't help very much. So what would we compare scientists to? What does it mean to be a non-scientist? I'll ask somebody else. What does it mean if you're not a scientist? What would an alternative be? Okay, yeah, please. Uses a scientific method, great. And what does that mean? That's great. Could you all hear? Okay, good. He was talking about the scientific method, which is a particular method. Has the scientific method always existed? Let's take a show of hands. How many think it's been around as long as people have been around? How many people think it was invented at a certain time? Yeah. Good. I guess my answer would be the second group is more correct than the first group. And that is if you use kind of a standard definition of science. And at least people in the West, which means Europe and places influenced by Europe, like the United States, we would say the scientific method was invented 4 or 5 centuries ago. You've probably heard the name Galileo or Newton. If you go to a museum, you'll see those names. Those are people who are called inventor of the scientific method. But the reason why the first group is okay too is people have always had problems they try to solve. In Rome, 2,000 years ago, they solved very complicated problems about building buildings, about irrigating the land, about aqueducts, where for water flow. And they didn't have the scientific method, but they did pretty well. One of the great mysteries, which scholar is a bigger word than scientist. Almost anybody who you run into who is teaching at college, and many people who are teaching in high school, would be scholars. They're historians or scientists or humanists. We could talk about what that means. Almost any problem that existed in the world was solved in China about the same time it was solved elsewhere. So, they invented clocks. They had very fancy kind of construction, very fancy kind of agriculture, but they didn't invent the scientific method. And what I'm saying is not particularly controversial. So I'm not going to try to give a lecture on how and why people like Galileo and Newton invented the scientific method, but it's worth something thinking about. And I'll just tell you one thing which you probably haven't thought about before. Part of the invention of the scientific method was, as the first fellow over there said, having problems and approaching them systematically, but then writing down what you did and having other people read what you wrote. And if you made diagrams the way people like Galileo and Newton did, look at those diagrams and criticize it. And that's what didn't happen in China. In China, they just solved the problem and went on to the next problem. They didn't try to document in writing and with pictures what they had done. Now, why do you think that mattered? Does anybody have an idea about that? Yeah. We'd like to hear from people from all different rows, so raise your hand if I'm not close to you. Yeah.
Well, later when people tried to figure out how they solved the problem, then maybe they had a clearer idea of how the steps they took than just figuring it out on their own.
That's right. Everybody could then look at the record and criticize it, but they could also go beyond it. Oh, Galileo did this. My name is Newton, and I'm going to try to go beyond that. It's a little bit like a competition. Somebody did it. They tell you how they did it. Can I do it better? That's what happens now in technology all the time. A new social media platform is invented, and somebody else says, I can invent a better one, but you have to have some kind of a record of it to do that. Was there another hand who wanted to talk about that question of... I need to have eyes back here. Yeah.
The reason things may not have been written down in places like China would be because they're as a community, they might have been more focused on solving the problem than thinking about how they solved the problem. And also, people like Galileo and Isaac Newton would devote their entire lives to solving problems, whereas the people in China may be like, okay, this is my life's goal. This is something that's standing in between me and that goal. I'm going to quickly fix this and then keep working towards that goal.
Great. Yeah, in England, they started something called the Royal Society. And there are hundreds of Royal Societies all over the world. But the Royal Society, I think Newton was the first president, was a place where people who worked full-time on these issues got together and presented papers, which meant they had to write it down, and then other people could criticize it. But I would also say there was another thing which was more true in Asia than in Europe. The United States was not part of the story at this point. And that is, in Asia, it was seen as very bad to criticize your teacher, to criticize your master. And that means that if your master said something right or wrong, you wouldn't argue with it. If you go back to the Magna Carta, how many have heard about the Magna Carta? Very good. I forget what it is. No, I can tell you the date and where it was. But the Magna Carta was challenging the authority of kings and queens. Basically the lords, and said, we want to have a right. We want to have a say too. And you can't have science unless there's some public statement written primarily, and unless you're willing to challenge authority. Now, all of this is in the past. Nowadays, science is known all over the world. Everybody has access to it. There are great scientists in every developed country. And indeed, one of the things which people like me worry about is who's going to support science in this country, because science needs financial support. You can't, like Newton, just work in your backyard. If you want to be studying genetics or studying black holes, it's an expensive kind of procedure. Now, I'm asking myself, why are we talking about the scientific method for the first 15 minutes or so? Big data. Has anybody heard that phrase before? Few people. I think one of them might be a parent. Well, I'm not going to try to define big data because I don't know exactly how to define it. But I was a sort of a wise ass or smart ass. I was asked what was the best invention of 2013 and what was the worst invention of 2013. And I said big data for both of them. Big data means now, because of social media and social networks, we can ask questions about thousands or millions of people. This was not possible before. But because of the kinds of data that Google or Amazon or Facebook gathers, we can ask questions. If 10,000 people buy one book, how likely is it that they're going to buy another book? Or if 20,000 people like this particular joke, what other jokes are they going to like? And that's actually social science. They've created a word for it, social physics, I just learned. But let me talk about social science, just give you a sentence, and I'm going to give you a bit of a talk, because otherwise they won't invite me back. So when you study atoms, you know what atoms are, or mesons, things like that. It doesn't matter what you find out. The atoms are going to be the same. We can't affect atoms. We can't affect molecules. When you study genes, which are the unit of heredity, it doesn't matter what you find out. The genes are going to do their thing. When you study human beings alone and together, psychology and sociology, what you find out might actually affect how human beings behave. Because human beings can read, remember, scientists write what they find out, and they talk about it. And maybe if you learn, okay, let me give you an example which will hit close to home. Let's say somebody does a social science study, and they find that out of 100 talks that are being given, when we open it up for questions, 95 times, which gender gets his hand up first? 95 out of 100. There's the answer. Now, I know Wendy's, Amendavel's mother, Wendy, went to a women's college, Smith College, and one reason why we have women's colleges is because men's hands can't go up first there because there are no men. But if at Dalton, say, people got angry with the fact that men's hands tend to go up first, there could be a real effort here, on the one hand, to get girls and women to have their hands first, and maybe get the boys to put their hands under their tuchus, which is a technical term for the behind. And the finding that men are likely to answer first would diminish. Indeed, at my school, Harvard, there was a president there who said women can't do science, and he didn't get to be president for very long after that. But of course, if you'd lived in the 19th century, you would say, of course, only men do science. But there was a famous writer, which some of you may have heard of, named Virginia Woolf, who wrote a book in the early 20th century called A Room of Your Own, a room of one's own, that what women need to be able to write is 300 guineas, which is a British, it's probably like maybe $15,000 or $20,000 now, and a room of your own. And if women didn't have any money and didn't have a room of their own, they weren't going to write. And it had nothing to do with whether they could write. Half the writers are women, and nobody notices, particularly whether it's a man or a woman. So findings from social science can actually change how people behave, and then you have different findings. All right, Howard. So who are you? What did you study? What did you find out? I just turned 70. That's a big deal if you haven't been 70 before. That's the age of your grandparents or great-grandparents. But, I went to school the way you did. And my parents were immigrants. And I was a good student. And the only question was whether I would become a doctor or lawyer. And the joke, if you're from a German Jewish background, as I am, was that a lawyer is a Jewish boy who hates the sight of blood, because you can't be a doctor if you are not willing to look at blood, and I didn't particularly like to look at blood. So I was going to become a lawyer, because that was literally the only option that was discussed. Nobody knew about becoming a professor, meaning not teaching elementary or middle school, but teaching older people. But when I went to college over 50 years ago, I got very interested in social science. Psychology, the study of the human mind, brain. Sociology, as the women in the front were saying, studies of groups and how people communicate and network. Or anthropology, we haven't used that word, but anthropology is the study of different cultures. Why did China not invent science? Why did science get invented in Italy and in England 4 centuries ago? Those are anthropological questions. So, but what was I going to do? My parents only thought I could be a doctor or a lawyer. They didn't know about being a professor. So I did something. I haven't talked much about this. I actually took pre-law courses and pre-med courses. And the reason why was I wanted to show my parents I could be a doctor or a lawyer, but I wasn't going to be. Again, I'm going to be a little bit stereotypical here. It's most difficult for children of East Asian families, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, to say, well, my parents want me to be an engineer or a scientist or a doctor, but I want to be an art historian or a social scientist. And my situation wasn't quite like that, but there are real cultural differences in what's considered to be an okay profession and not. So, capsulating, I decided to study developmental psychology. That's the study of how children develop cognitively, thinking, emotionally, socially. And my own interest really was in the organization of the mind when you're an infant, when you're 5 years old, when you are, as you are, 12, 13, 14, and so on. But when I was almost through with graduate school, first you go to college, then you go to get a higher degree, there was a question that puzzled me. I was very interested in how artists work, how artists think, but I was having a lot of trouble figuring out what makes an artist tick, a painter, a musician, dancer, writer. And then I had one of those chance encounters which change the course of one's life. I went to hear a very distinguished neurologist. Anybody know what a neurologist is? Oh, anybody have a parent that's a neurologist? That's interesting. Well, a neurologist basically studies what happens when there's something wrong with your nervous system. And I became interested what happens to people who are ordinary, but who have a stroke where the blood to the brain gets cut off, or a tumor which reorganizes the brain because it has pressure on the whole brain, or trauma, which means you're in an accident, or you have a bullet wound or something like that. And it turns out, this is better known now than it was 50 years ago, that the single most important thing of having damage to your brain is where in the brain it is. Is it on the left hemisphere or the right hemisphere? Is it toward the front or toward the back? Is it superficial or deep? If you're a good neurologist and I say the person is right-handed, they have a left hemisphere stroke in the upper anterior lobe or something like that, the neurologists say, well, that person's probably going to be able to understand pretty well, but it's going to have trouble articulating longer thoughts. So this became fascinating to me because what happens if an artist has a stroke? What happens if a musician who's composing or playing an instrument has a stroke? What happens if a painter has a stroke? And that's what we call an experiment in nature. Because fortunately, I can't, as a scientist, go and poke a hole here in your head and here in your head and see what happens. We do that with animals, and that's very controversial. Should we be allowed to damage the brains of primates, of monkeys or gorillas, to find out what happens? That's very, very. Let's do a show of hands. How many people think that in order to treat human beings more intelligently, we should be allowed to create brain damage in a monkey or in a chimpanzee? How many people would prefer? Now, how many people think we shouldn't be allowed? We'll make it a stark. Okay, well, it's quite evenly divided, and that probably means that it's worth discussing because people have strong feelings about that. Anyway, to cut to the chase, it turned out that studying people with brain damage was an excellent way to figure out how the mind and the brain works in those of us who are lucky enough not to have brain damage, as far as we know. Now, I can't recognize faces. There's a long term called prosopagnosia. And if I meet your teacher tomorrow, I'm not going to recognize her face because I can't do that. That's probably a kind of brain damage, but fortunately, it doesn't send you to the hospital for surgery. It's just something you live with. So, for the 20 years after I got my doctorate, which is what happens after college, I spent the mornings working in a hospital with people who had brain damage. And in the afternoon, I spent time with kids, your age, younger, older, giving them various kinds of tasks in the arts, making metaphor, making paintings, looking for painting styles, things like that. And it was out of that kind of schizophrenic life. Hospital, old veterans who were male, because it was a veterans hospital, and there were very few women veterans, so there were occasionally some. In the afternoon with kids like you. And what I was seeing every day was you could be strong in one area, average in the second area, and very poor in the third area. So if you had a certain kind of brain damage, your language might be impaired, but you'd be fine in finding your way around the hospital, in reading other people's emotions, in singing a song. And so what that says is the mind-brain isn't just one pudding. It has fairly specific kinds of capacities. And as I said, if you have an injury here, it might impair your language. If you have an injury here, it might impair your music. If you have an injury here, it would impair your ability to get around an unfamiliar place and so on. And then particularly with young people looking at the arts, you have kids who'd be very good in music, and you just couldn't tell, would they be good in language? Would they be good in understanding other people? Would they be good in understanding themselves? So this is what I was noticing every day in the 1970s. Now, one of the things you probably know about science, whether or not you have the word, is that often there's something that everybody sees, but most people don't pay any attention to. You're growing something in a petri dish, and suddenly it stops growing, or it changes color. And most of us would say, oh, there's something wrong with this preparation, let me just get another one instead, and look at that Petri dish instead. But the scientist says, why has this stopped growing? Why has it changed color? What could we learn from that? And so we might say, the scientist takes what might seem ordinary and problematizes it. I think the person who was defining science says, what's going on here? You've all heard Einstein, right? His most famous scientist. Einstein came up with his ideas because he was trying to figure out how could you get trains in different cities to synchronize time sufficiently so it was, if it was 10:01:00 in Geneva, it would be 10:01:00 in Bern, two cities in Switzerland. Now that problem has always existed. How do you know that there's the same time in place A and in place B? But Einstein, who was no slouch, began to wonder, is there such a thing as absolute time? And that gave rise to the theory of relativity, special relativity, general relativity. And when Time magazine, at the end of the 20th century, picked the most important person of the 20th century, they didn't pick Winston Churchill or Mahatma Gandhi, who might have been my choices. They picked Einstein. And of course, when Einstein was thinking about time travel, he wasn't thinking about atomic bombs, but it was out of Einstein's work that we eventually had nuclear weapons. And that's another thing about science, really important. You can become interested in one thing purely because it's interesting, but it may turn out to do something that's wonderful for human beings or terrible for human beings. Understanding chemicals is wonderful. Creating chemical warfare is not. So the same discoveries can lead to positive things or negative things, and almost any discovery, no matter how it just seems to be in the head, eventually gets used in some way. So scientists have a responsibility to think about what the implications of what they do. So Howard, you talk about, we're going to take you back 35 years. You're seeing adults with very strange combinations of abilities and disabilities. You're seeing kids who are strong in one thing, average in another, not very good in the third. Now, clearly people have seen this before. I wasn't the first person to see it. But it's this which led to the development of the theory, which I said I was going to talk about today, multiple intelligences theory. Now, how many of you have actually studied a bit about this in class? Okay. Well, I'm going to put you a bit on the spot and ask you, what have you learned? And don't feel badly if you don't have it totally right. I didn't have it totally right initially either. But who wants to, okay, let's see if we can, over here. Yeah. Yeah. Yes? MI theory, multiple intelligences theory.
Well, we learned how there were 8 different intelligences. Interpersonal, intrapersonal, spatial, musical, logical, I don't remember all of them, and how different people will have different strengths in certain areas. And we went home and we asked our parents, which ones they thought were our intelligences, and we compared their opinions to our opinions, and in some cases they were very similar, and in others they were completely different.
That's terrific. Thank you. I'm going to go home. Yeah, not all of you have studied this. So your name is? Dominique? What Dominique was saying is that 30 years ago, I published about multiple intelligences, and what I claimed was that human beings have, at the time I said 7, but now there's been inflation, so we have 8, and I've actually talked about 2 candidate additional intelligences, which, if I remember, I'll mention them. So basically, the wonderful thing about MI theory and the terrible thing about MI theory is that you can summarize it very, very briefly, as we've just done. Namely, the claim is that all of us have a number of different intelligences, plural, but people differ, parents, siblings, random people, in which intelligences they're good in, which intelligences they're average in which intelligences they're not very good in. Now, I wrote a 400-page book with hundreds and hundreds of footnotes. Why would I have written a big, long book when I just gave you the Twitter version of MI theory? Why write a big, long book? Okay, right there in the middle, your hand went up first.
You would have probably written a long book, so you could have avoided major controversies, and like other leading scientists probably would have read your book and probably built off your ideas and like gave them a systematic way to build off your ideas or improve it.
Very good. First of all, I wrote it down, right, which is what scientists and scholars do. I try to provide a lot of evidence in support of my claim. And as this young man was saying, I try to anticipate some of the criticisms, sort of head them off at the pass, right? Before people said, oh, this is stupid, or you didn't think of this, you try to cover your behind when you write a book. Anybody else want to add about why you might write a book? Was I trying to get promoted? Yeah, yeah, in front here.
As you said earlier, science is kind of built off of people recording how they got to the solution of a problem, and it presents other scientists with the opportunity to criticize that. And so by writing a book, you explained your thinking of how you got to the solution and how you figured out the theory. So as you said, other scientists can build off of that, and also, I guess, find a flaw if there is one, and help it just in the bigger scheme of things, help develop this theory further.
Great. Also, it makes your mother happy, and I dedicated it to my wife. So, you have the book. The book was called Frames of Mind: The Theory of Multiple Intelligences, and it's in your library if you want to look at it. I'm now going to tell you a bit what it's like to do something like this, and I'm going to talk a bit about what may surprise you, but there's no point in my coming here unless I'm honest with you and share with you what I think. And kids are very good. You're very good BS detectors. So if somebody's telling you BS, you can tell. There was an artist named Andy Warhol. Has anybody heard of him? Yeah, oh my. And he said, even before my book came out, nothing to do with my book, he said in the future, everybody's going to be famous for 15 minutes. And he said that long before we had Facebook or Twitter or anything like that. But he realized that we live in a time where there's kind of a celebrity culture, but, you know, if I go outside of the building and hang myself, I'll have 15 minutes of fame. Won't help me any, but, you know, scholar kills himself in front of Dalton School. You know, that's the kind of a story. So I had my 15 minutes of fame when I wrote this book. And it's a New York story about how I knew that. I had written some books before, and I was already pretty well known in psychology. But I gave a talk at the Hilton Hotel on 54th and 6th Avenue. Do any of you know that hotel? Yeah. And I was assigned a room. It was an education audience, and there were maybe 100 and 150 seats, about this auditorium. This auditorium is somewhat bigger. And when I got to the room, I could almost not get into the room. And when I actually walked in, there was kind of like a hush in the room. There's the guy who wrote that book. And I realized that I now, at least for 15 minutes, was in a different place. Namely, people had a certain awe because the guy who did this stuff was there. 15 minutes ends pretty fast, and I was able to go back to my work, and I've written probably 20 books since, but nothing has had the same impact as this book. So here's the thing that may surprise you. This idea about multiple intelligences has never been accepted by the scientific community. And I therefore use the word social science because it's not exactly the same as physical or natural science. I'm going to say a bit more about that. But there was a community where it was accepted quite readily, and that was the education community. And particularly the community not of college or even the later years of high school, but the community of educators who are working with very young children, preschool, elementary, middle, and maybe the beginning of high school. And I would never have predicted this, because when I wrote the book, Frames of Mind, I was a psychologist, and I was writing for psychologists. And there were a few chapters where I mentioned education, but I really didn't know much about education. I couldn't have passed a test, because my teaching had been at college and graduate school. Does anybody have an idea of why we had this kind of schizophrenic reaction, scientists not really liking the theory, and educators being very enthusiastic about it? Yes. Yes, the woman there with the big armband here. Yeah, next to, I'm colorblind too, so I can't say the color of your blouse. Yes, she.
So the theory doesn't necessarily have this large amount of, it does have the social science in it, but it doesn't really have this large amount of science, but it does deal with something that the educators and the teachers, especially of younger kids, could see, and it explained why certain kids were good at some things but not as good at others.
Okay, that's very good. Doesn't seem to write very well. Is there another marker there? Okay, thanks. Yeah. So let's say educators and parents, social science, and I'm going to be provocative here, real science. How many of you have parents or grandparents who are doing physics or chemistry? How many of you have parents or grandparents who are doing psychology or sociology or anthropology? Okay, a smattering. So you were saying that the question of what was the evidence was an important question for scientists. And whereas, would you want to say again what you were saying about parents and educators? Great. Yeah, let's say rings true. This is very important, because everybody who's been teaching for a while knows that there's some kids who are good in everything and some kids who are not very good in anything, but most kids have what I call a jagged profile. And again, if somebody's very good in dance, you simply can't tell whether they're going to be very good in learning French. There's no particular connection. So it rings true. Who would like to contribute to this question of why we had this split between, yes, I think we have seen a lot of the same hands. Maybe I'm going to ask who hasn't spoken yet. Okay, right next, yeah, right. Yes.
Well, maybe. Maybe it's because real scientists, you didn't do a lot. Well, you did obviously have a lot of experience, but there were no extensive tests they could do.
Fantastic. Tests. Let me stop there because that's so important. You've all heard of the IQ test, right? And you've probably taken an IQ test, maybe even to get into Dalton. You have to take a, yeah, all right. It would not be an exaggeration to say that psychology is the science of tests. And one of the great inventions of psychology for over 100 years has been the IQ test, where you ask a bunch of questions, either orally by a tester or written down. And the SAT, which you all know about, is kind of an IQ test, though they keep claiming it's not. And psychologists love tests, and they're very wary, very leery, very nervous about somebody who puts forth a theory, like MI theory, but doesn't have a test. Now, I could have invented a test. In fact, people offered me lots of money to invent a test, but there was various reasons, and next time I come here I'll tell you why I decided not to have a test. So if you had a psychologist here, she would say, well, how can we believe MI theory when we don't have tests for it? And then I would have a discussion with that psychologist. Anybody else want to contribute to, yes, right next to the previous person, yeah.
So also your theory was more colorful and it kind of gave everyone an intelligence and was kind of more interpretive based on the individual, not on a test that was right or wrong.
Well, this notion, I'm going to call it democratic, that just because you don't happen to do well in SAT doesn't mean you're a dummy. That's very important. But what you said is how many people interpret the theory, but unfortunately it's not exactly what I said, because I never claimed that everybody was intelligent in something, even though probably 90% of people who know about my work think that's what I claimed. What I said a minute ago, and no criticism that you picked up, is life isn't fair, and there's the occasional person, you know, let's use Bill Clinton as an example, who's good in many, many different things. And of course there are people who aren't good in anything. So I don't claim that everybody's got a smart area, but it is democratic because when you broaden the tent of what counts as intelligence, then you allow more people to think about themselves as smart. Time is running out, I think because we have to close at 11, right? So let me tell you something which may surprise you. I could have written exactly the same book, and if I had just changed a word on the title page, I would never have had those 15 minutes of fame, and I would never be invited to the Dalton School. The thing I did, and I wasn't even aware really of what I had done, though a colleague of mine was, I had used the word intelligence and pluralized it. If I'd written a book called The 7 or 8 Talents, nobody would have paid the slightest bit of attention, because everybody knows that you can be talented in dance or talented in soccer or talented in chess, and it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be talented in understanding other people. It was the step of pluralizing the word intelligence, and even nowadays when I write it in any kind of a word program, I get an underlining here because the word intelligence doesn't exist, but I was picking a fight with what we'll call the IQ establishment, because psychologists make a lot of money creating tests. And I was saying, you know, your test may talk about who's good in language and logic, but it doesn't touch many other kinds of things. And moreover, these other things can't be tested by paper and pencil. That's why I didn't create any tests. If I'd said 7 talents, they would have said, fine, everybody's talented. What we're cared about is what's smart. Now, let me talk just a bit about what it means to be smart. Because most of us think that we know what it means to be smart, but it actually is a trickier term than you might believe, and it changes over time. Typically, what people mean when they say somebody is smart is that he or she does well in a certain kind of school. And I don't think you would be here unless you were pretty smart in that way. But even within a school, the fact that you're very good with poetry doesn't mean you're going to be good in coding, or the very fact that you're very good in drawing doesn't mean that you're going to be good in pre-calculus. So the notion of smart as being one thing breaks down. But even more so, and this is really important, maybe the most important thing I say today, over the course of history, what we think is smart changes. So when I was writing Frames of Mind, I was very interested in people who lived in the South Seas and who could navigate among hundreds or even thousands of islands without a compass, just by looking at the stars in the sky and the way that boats passed over water of different kinds of depth. Because what it means to be smart in a society like that is totally different than what it means to be smart in, let's say, Singapore today or Rwanda today. Also, 150 years ago, if you wanted to get into my college, Harvard, there wasn't a math test, there wasn't a science test. There were tests in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. And if you couldn't read those languages, you wouldn't get in. Now we would sort of laugh at that. And being good with language is much less important to getting into college nowadays than it was even when I applied, and certainly when people who applied in the middle of the 19th century did. So what counts as smart changes depending where in the world you are and what century you're living in. And this is why this is so important. As digital devices get smarter and smarter, what we will count as smart may change a lot. Wendy, my relative, deals in the world of creative artists. Being able to be an artistic creator may turn out to be much more important 30 years from now than it was 30 years ago, because so many things that we now reward people for doing, machines are going to be able to do better than we can, and we won't need to have people doing those things. So even if Gardner's intelligence theory is long since forgotten, and nobody knows the list of the 7, 8, 9, or 10 intelligences, the notion that what we value and why is going to change as long as human beings live in different societies, and the smarter our machines get, the more big data there are, the more applications there are, what we will value in human beings is going to change. And anybody who thinks that what it means to be smart is what it meant in your grandparents' day to be smart is making a foolish assumption. And just to close on one of the points I was making earlier, that's why social science is so important. What it means to be smart for a rat or an ant is not going to change. But because we human beings change our world, because we invent new things, because we value new kinds of things, you know, being liked on Facebook was not something anybody had to worry about when I was growing up. What it means to be smart is going to continue to change. And if there's any reason why I should continue to be listened to, at least from the sidelines, is because I was the first person to directly challenge the IQ establishment, which think they owned what intelligence was. They knew how to test it, and everybody else was just wasting their time. Thank you for an hour. It's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gardner. So, ladies and gentlemen, just I want to try to dismiss in pieces because right now we also have the 4th and 5th grade dismissing to go out to field day, so it's a little crowded in the lobby. Parents, if I could ask you to sit tight for 1 second. 7th and 8th graders, please use the aisle closest to you and go right up to your 11 o'clock class. Thanks, guys.